As I'm recording this right now, it's March 22nd, my birthday, and I figured what better way to celebrate today than to give you guys a video all about what is considered to be, by many, as the most dangerous band to ever exist, and what I would argue is the most extreme form of performance art conducted by any musical act ever on planet Earth. That all being about Hanatarash. For those who are unaware, Hanatarash is a noise project formed in Osaka, Japan in the year 1983. The band was formed by lead vocalist and frontman Yamataka Ai and guitarist Mitsuro Tabata when they met at an Einstürzend Neubauten show. A few years later, in 1985, Hanatarash would recruit another member, that being Iko Takatani, who would end up being their drummer. The translation for Hanatarash is Japanese to English to sniveler, which is just a slang term for someone with a runny nose. It also translates to snot nose. And originally the name for this group was called Hanatarashi, plural, but shortly after they changed it to Hanatarash as we know it today. Although technically they would use the name Hanatarashi again, but for one of their album releases in 1985. Now, to address the elephant in the room and talk about what Hanatarash is mainly known for would be their extreme version of performance art that would be, more often than not, extremely dangerous for themselves and the audience witnessing them. Throughout the short time span of the early to mid 80s, Hanatarash would do quite a handful of shows in Japan. Once again, playing in the style of noise, or in this case it's labeled as Japan noise, all in one word, which isn't necessarily a music genre, but more of a music tag referencing the Japanese noise scene during the 80s. Some noticeable names would obviously be Merzbow, Hijo Kadan, Incapacitants, and the Geriger Gege. That, again, this is all in the style of noise music that is very improv, harsh, and wild, and really relies on being in the moment to truly be immersed by it. There's been quite a handful of times that I've seen people compare Japan noise and just noise music in general to the art movement known as Dadaism, which started back in the early 20th century right next to the Surrealist movement. And really what Dadaism is, it's a form of art that is very anti-establishment. It really challenges the norms of what we perceive as art, where the irrational thought is more encouraged with these ideas, and again, more of that improvisation that, in a way, noise music as we understand it is kind of like the modern form of Dadaism, or draws very similar parallels to it. While Hanatarash falls in line musically with the term Japan noise, what really separates them from the rest of the pack is their stage antics. Their style of performance art got very extreme and brutally violent. Such antics would be grabbing sheets of glass and just throwing them on stage so that it would shatter, and all the bits of glass would just fly everywhere, even in the audience, to hurtling the sheets of glass at the audience themselves, to basically just destroying venues, whether it be grabbing canisters, barrels, scrap metal, and just whipping it at the walls and causing damage. And there's even one picture that I saw that Yamataka Ai is holding a wrecking ball, which I can only assume he would just cause more destruction and damage with that type of equipment. Funny enough, that's all pretty standard for her Hanatarash show, because it gets even wilder. One event that's been brought up numerous times by articles is that Yamataka Ai supposedly got a hold of a deceased cat. No one knows exactly how, and there's been rumors that spread that he found that deceased cat like in an alleyway or behind a dumpster around the venue before their show. Got that deceased cat, brought it to the show, and in front of the audience sliced the cat in half with a machete. Or at another show where Yamataka Ai strapped a circular saw to his back, and with all of the antics and jumping around and energy that he would unleash at any Hanatarash performance, the strap got undone and the saw ended up hitting his leg, really getting close to his femoral artery and almost making that performance lethal, and he's lucky enough that he still has his leg to this day. But Hanatarash's most notorious event easily has to involve the incident where they utilized a bulldozer, out of all things. So as the story goes, in 1985, Hanatarash were to do another show. This one would be a little bit different, as they made all the audience attendees sign a waiver form that attending this show, Hanatarash was not responsible for any injuries that would occur to them witnessing them perform live. And most people, I'm assuming, didn't think much of it, as Hanatarash is already infamous enough for doing all of these antics. What makes this any different? If you can survive one, you can survive the rest. But what made it different is that Yamataka Ai wouldn't come on stage through the backstage or just hopping on stage. He wanted to come in on a bulldozer through the venue's wall, which ended up happening, believe it or not. And while there's no video footage that exists of it, there are photos archived on the internet, which I'll have a link provided to in the description if you want to check out all of them. And here's some of them on screen right now. And after doing that, which is already crazy enough, regardless if it's a show or any other event happening, he then threatened the audience and the venue that if they didn't start moving or getting, riled up, that he was going to get Molotov cocktails and burn down the venue and throwing them on stage. That performance cost the venue in damage repairs of upwards to 600,000 yen, or 9,000 US dollars, or for today's currency, it would be 780,000 yen, or 27,000 US dollars. Whenever I read about Hanatarash and I see the pictures that correlate with these events, I always think to myself, how do you get to this point, this mentality, where you're willing to use a bulldozer as a form of performance art for your set? Like, how do you get to this point? Each and every time I read about Hanatarash, and there are some clues that kind of lead into why this would end up happening. For starters, when it came to the formation of Hanatarash, it mainly consists of members that felt as if punk music overall during this time period in the 80s was becoming more mainstream. It really became a thing it was thought out to be against. It kind of became part of the establishment. And they wanted to take punk music back to its roots, again, really focusing and honing into the idea of anti-establishment, anti-norms, anything that was just against the grain is what Hanatarash was really trying to represent with literally anything they would do, whether it be their music releases to, again, their stage performances. Backtracking a little bit here, but with Japan's noise scene gaining momentum during this time as well, Hanatarash would adapt that form of music and style with their mentality. So basically what it kind of was, Hanatarash overall, is it's noise music being created by individuals who have the mentality of the anti-establishment punk mindset. Another connection that I found as I was doing as much research and gathering as much information as I could about Hanatarash is a few years back, a YouTube channel, I believe it's called Pad Chennington, did a video all about Hanatarash. And one connection that he made that was quite interesting is that he stated that Hanatarash falls in line with the style of music simply known as danger music. To explain it in simplest terms, danger music is basically just an extreme form of performance art. So basically, performance art that is just genuinely violent. While the idea of dangerous performance art has been a thing for decades, stretching all the way back to the 70s and even further if you're quite adventurous to look into it, one thing that immediately came to mind when I heard that, when you consider Japan's music scene during the early 80s, would be a hardcore punk band called Gism. If you know anything about Japanese hardcore punk or just punk music overall, you know of Gism. They are extremely respected, and they gained quite a bit of notoriety, not only for critical acclaim because of their debut full-length album, Detestation, which is a great mixture of hardcore punk laced together with these very metal-influenced melodies, but their stage antics were extremely violent. Most of these antics, I believe, even predate the formation of Hanatarash, but one of them you can find here on YouTube, where one of the members of GISM has a flamethrower and shooting it out at the audience, to other accounts where they get into fist fights with the audience members, throwing fireworks and firecrackers at the audience, to even, I've read that they've chased audience members with loaded guns and saw blades. I mean, I would even argue to some degree that GISM is just as, if not even more dangerous than Hanatarash to some degree. And maybe I'm forcing some connections here, but I feel like with GISM really introducing the idea of danger music to the Japanese punk and extreme music scene during this time, it really set the stage for other bands to adapt or adopt it. And I do feel like wholeheartedly Hanatarash was one of them. While that bulldozer performance gained them more recognition among its fans for its very outlandish and super dangerous stunt that they pulled, what it ended up ruining was their reputation among the area, because basically every single venue banned them from ever performing at their spots. From my understanding, when it came to Hanatarash performing throughout the remaining years of the 80s, is that the only places they could perform were at like warehouses or abandoned factories, because no venue wanted them there. And I've also heard rumors that supposedly the reason why they were still performing quite a lot throughout the 80s and releasing quite a handful of albums throughout that decade as well was to gain as much money as possible to help repay back all of the damages that they owed to the venues that they basically destroyed. Again, I can't confirm this, and this is just all rumors. During the late 80s and early 90s, Hanatarash would remain silent with live shows. However, it wouldn't be until the mid-90s where Hanatarash would return to live performances on the only condition that they had to promise to the venues that they performed at that they would really restrict their violent antics that they were known for. As for the actual music and albums put out by Hanatarash, is that, yes, at face value, you can just label it as noise or some wild, weird form of experimental music, which, yes, it is. I'm not denying that. But when you really take a moment to dive into their discography, from releases such as Hanatarashi, Hanatarash 2, 3, 4, and I believe it goes up to 5, to Worst Skeleton and other releases by them, is that, yeah, there's a lot of improvisation. It's very abrasive and static fueled. It has all those components. But what makes Hanatarash really interesting with their sounds and textures is that they utilize really any form of like unconventional ideas of instrumentation, utilizing such ideas as using power tools as a form of instruments throughout some of their recordings. That in terms of their mentality and ideas, it takes a lot of influence from groups such as Neubauten, which they clearly take influence from, not just because the members met at one of their shows, but there is one of their performances that have been uploaded here on YouTube of a Hanatarash show where they are utilizing just power tools as forms of instrumentation, exactly the same way as Neubauten did in the same time period of the early 80s. One of their albums that gets the most amount of attention is always Hanatarash 3. That, yeah, for the first 5 to 7 minutes, it's just chaotic noise. There's a bunch of screaming. It feels like just everything's tumbling down a hill in terms of like how it's recorded. But when you get to around the 10-minute mark and there on out, it gets very ambient. There's a form of composition almost, in a sense. They utilize a lot of the reverb as a sense of atmosphere. The vocals utilize other textures. It feels like, again, a form of like this clusterfuck, but very artistic at the same time. That it's intriguing, it's avant-garde, it's very different. It's something that you really need to hear to truly understand and make sense of for your own. But I can't emphasize this enough when it comes, again, to the music of Hanatarash. It is definitely not for everyone. It's noise, it's experimental, it's, you know, anti-norms when it comes to the music. It's definitely for people who want a challenge. It's definitely for people who are looking to see what's at the very ends of what can even be considered music. But I do feel like for those thrill seekers that look for experimental music that challenges every sense of that word, you'll find it with Hanatarash. As for present day, it's been considered that they've been on this hiatus, but that was announced back in 1998. So for the most part, they've considered it to be inactive or disbanded. It's also worth mentioning that Yamataka Eye, along with other members of Hanatarash, would form Boredoms back in 1986, a very respected and adventurous noise rock band that in some ways you can describe Boredoms as basically the spiritual continuation of Hanatarash, only it actually has structure with its orthodox forms of instrumentation here, that it borrows a lot of ideas from the whole like no wave scene back in the late 70s and early 80s, but with a lot more adventurous and Japan noise-esque types of ideas here. That again, if you're looking for very adventurous, crazy, wild music, Boredoms is a must-know in the region of noise rock. And because of Boredom's strong reputation and Yamataka Eye's just really signature wild vocals that he would unleash, it's a huge reason as to why he gained the opportunity to work with John Zorn with some of the albums of Naked City, and you can hear the best of his vocal execution on full display on this album. Other than that, as of recently, none of the members have really been that active with doing music, other than Yamataka Eye has done his own like DJ side project. In conclusion, Hanatarash's legacy is just chaos in the purest way possible. It is just so bizarre, so out there, and so dangerous. And I feel like because of what they've done in their history and their stage antics and their music, it's attracted individuals who want crazy, insane, abstract, and abnormal ways of creating music. For example, when it comes to Yamataka Eye's vocal performance, as signature and wild as it is, he's influenced quite a handful of grindcore vocalists. I mean, John Cheng from Discordance Axis takes a lot of inspiration from him with his work with Boredoms. I know Endon takes a lot of influence from Hanatarash and Boredoms. To even Mike Patton, when it comes to Hanatarash, I believe it's the album 4, with the way they were constructing and doing all of the abrasive reverb and abstract ways of noises, Mike Patton took a bit of influence on that on his solo work. It's really something that is meant for the people who look for abstract art in the most intense and dangerous and just bizarre ways possible. And that'll do it for this video, guys. Like always, links provided to everything I talked about will be in the description below. Really curious to know what you think of Hanatarash and just Japan noise as a whole down in the comments. And like always, make sure you guys drink plenty of water to stay hydrated and have a great day.